think it's good morning from me, as they say. We are extremely fortunate to have a truly international and distinguished panel for you this morning. May I just briefly introduce them, and then they're going to introduce themselves and answer some questions for us. We have Alan Cairns, MP for Vale of Glamorgan. We have Stefan Kromielicki from Poland. He'll explain what he does shortly. All the way from Reno, as it were, Mayor Hilary Sheevey, and Elisabetta Pasternak from Brussels, and Tom Spiller all the way from London, as am I. So good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about the role of governments in fostering innovation. And what I'm going to do is, and the plan today is for basically each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, in turn, as it were, answer a specific question or deal with a specific subject which is close to them, and then we're going to try and get an interactive discussion going amongst the panel. We are hopeful, and I shall do my very best to ensure that we have about 10 minutes left for questions from the floor. As I always say in these things, please don't feel that any question is confined to what we've been discussing. It may be that there's something burning you'd like to ask us, and I'm sure with the collective expertise of the panel here, we'll have at least a decent answer for you. So I'm going to, without further ado, introduce Alan Cairns, MP from Vale of Glamorgan, and he is going to talk about caution and lack of understanding within governments.
Well, yeah, thanks, Dean. So, as Dean said, my name is Alan Cairns. I'm a Member of Parliament here in the UK. I've had the privilege of serving in the UK Cabinet through 3 Prime Ministers with a good understanding of colleagues and government processes, and also a whole host of civil servants and regulators that obviously are accountable to the public, and the government and Parliament will hold them to account. I have a strong interest in technology, strong interest in blockchain, and also in finance. So bringing all of these together, I would say if I asked some colleagues in Parliament what do they understand about blockchain, there would be a tiny number that would understand what it means. They'd automatically think it was cryptocurrencies. They automatically think dark web. So it has not a branding challenge, but it has an understanding challenge with members of Parliament. And particularly with officials. And therefore, as a result, without some politicians or some policy leaders driving policy and trying to communicate how blockchain can really can bring about a transformational difference in so many public service areas. People don't need to understand the mechanics, or I should say the technology behind something, in order to appreciate the benefits. So I think for us as a wider community, we have got a collective challenge to try to, first of all, I think we need to be differentiating cryptocurrencies with blockchain, and we need to be highlighting what blockchain does in order to improve some policy outcomes. So one of the ones, well, I can go.
I was going to say, Alan, thank you. I mean, can I ask you this? It's interesting because obviously in my work as a lawyer in this field, one of the issues is the lack of adoption. And I think that may well be because of the interaction and the interrelationship that people wrongly perceive between cryptocurrency and blockchain. Says he was the author of a textbook on cryptocurrency and blockchain, but that doesn't help matters perhaps. But can you just help us really as to how, in your role, and you're vice chair, I think, of the British Blockchain Association, how you're trying to break that down in terms of education piece?
Well, yes, it's about focusing on discrete areas of policy where blockchain can be transformational. So chatting with some colleagues a little bit earlier, I was highlighting land transfer. I mean, it's a pretty inefficient, expensive, cumbersome, inaccurate process, full of errors as it stands. And blockchain could offer such a solution, make it efficient, make that area of transactions much more liquid, if you like, much more responsive to market demand, would release a huge resource into the economy. And that is something that is pretty poor now. Everyone recognizes it's poor. Introducing blockchain technology into it would, without a question, make it much more efficient, and people would see the improvement that comes from that. It then has nothing to do with cryptocurrency. It's quite discrete. It could almost be rolled out on a pilot basis or on a regional basis. And I think that would give confidence to policymakers, to regulators, to civil servants. Now, we have a separate way we can highlight it, we have in the UK a process what we call Sandbox, and that is the opportunity to pilot stuff. Pilot initiatives without the risk of the challenges that people would get thereafter. And it allows the regulators to test the process, to test the market. And I think a blockchain initiative associated with one area of policy where we know it can be transformational. I've highlighted one, but it could be NHS medical records is another one. But that is something that people would show greater caution over because it's so personal. And I think we need to find that area, and I think land transaction is probably amongst the ripest fruit in order to pick off.
Isn't one of the issues, and we'll go on to the next speaker shortly, but isn't one of the issues, particularly in relation to the NHS, is that there are a series of different governing bodies, even within the UK. We have NHS England, Wales, etc.
Yeah.
So the problem then is speaking across those particular institutions.
You're absolutely right, and that's why I think land registry is much more straightforward. It's got one primary agency. It's quite straightforward. The other area is car transactions. You know, the DVLA. I mean, that is one office almost, and that could easily be blockchain technology could easily be brought into that, and it would prevent so much fraud, so much risk that's in the process as it stands. It would almost eliminate it. And again, that's another area. So we need to be focusing, I think, and targeting where blockchain can make a difference, bring about change in a positive way. And as a result, when people get the hang of it, people understand it, what it does, rather than the technology behind it, then I think the opportunities are limitless for things like the NHS, for so many other areas of policy. The Food Standards Agency are running a pilot at the moment about the traceability of foods. Again, that's something that's quite discreet. So there are some agencies that are prepared to try it, but they also need policymakers and credible figures within the sector to say, look, this is something that we really can be transformational. And I'm looking to listen to Hillary and others about where it has been used, where we can learn from in order to roll it out elsewhere.
Well, happily for us, we'll hear from Hillary shortly. I'm going to move on to Tom. Tom, you're going to talk to us about, you're a lawyer at Rosenblatt. You're going to talk to us about being involved in multi-jurisdictional disputes and things of that nature in your legal practice.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dean. Good morning, everybody. So my name's Tom. I'm from a law firm called Rosenblatt. We're one of the first law firms in this country to list on the stock exchange when there were about 80 of us in total at the time. We do a lot of stuff with startups, traditionally from the financial services world, so we're seeing more and more from the blockchain world. I won't say crypto, thank you, Alan. And through the Rosenblatt Incubator Program. But we're mainly known for our litigation. And I can tell you we punch well above our weight, despite the fact we still have a very low head count. And we're currently, as at today, taking on governments on 4 different continents. I am so interested in the topic of blockchain and the broader ecosystem that it encapsulates. And it is so interesting, the different perspectives, the different approaches of governments in the world. Because to date, I think the main differentiating factor on how you view blockchain is likely to be geography. Some people in some parts of the world see it as a means to resolve instances of market or state failure. I'm thinking about people in Argentina, people in Turkey, and people in Ukraine. Some people see it as a means of transferring funds to relatives in another country without getting their eyes gouged out by the payment companies over that process. And then there are others who see it as a means of financial speculation, if you like, either via trading or via investing in their pension. There are a smaller number of people who are sort of from the regulatory sort of world who may see it as a risk only. But those different perspectives exist throughout the world and have been adopted in different ways by different states. There are some countries that just don't want it. They just see it as competition. I'm talking about the Chinas, the Indias, the Nigerias of this world. And they've, I think, singularly failed to understand that the reason why blockchain, dare I say it, crypto is popular in their company is because of them. There are some states whose first experience of the blockchain world will have been very negative. It will have been potentially the Americans with Silk Road, with North Korean activity, with illegal terrorist fundraising from the likes of Hamas. And there are some who reacted as a result of a consumer fraud, such as the Mt. Gox fraud in Japan, or the Terra Luna collapse in South Korea. And those are all totally different start points, I think, and that shows why there have been such varying regulatory reactions. I think it's so interesting to see that as a regulator, you have to balance effectively the desire to be a gatekeeper, as many regulators have done. They simply say, no, this is our club, you're not coming in, you're wearing the wrong tie. And the need to be, if you like, a gamekeeper, someone who's charged with nurturing an environment, maintaining stocks, and yes, shooting the odd poacher. And for my money, having studied the sort of jurisdictions of many different parts of the world, is often have to do in my job where you're involving often something that's got a British dynamic, an American dynamic, and maybe a third-party country, maybe in Central Asia or sort of the Far East. For my money, the Japanese, balancing of those two roles of gatekeeper and gamekeeper is the most interesting. They effectively began their regulatory approach in the wake of the Mt. Gox scandal, when a large number of Japanese consumers had had their money taken from them. And it could have been very easy for them to simply bring down the shutters and say, no, we're just going to ban it. This is something that is tulip mania. It's just people having their money stolen from them by slick snake oil salesmen. But instead, they did two things. They interacted and engaged with what they saw as the sophisticated part of their domestic industry, but at the same time, and said there will be a licensing regime. There will have to be some of you, if you aren't able to come up to the sufficient standards that we require for our citizens, you will be out of business. But at the same time, they did something radical. They recognized Bitcoin in particular as legal tender. So they were effectively using carrot and stick at the same time in quite radical ways. And I would say it's paid them dividends. I mean, that by comparison, the Korean reaction resulted in them going from a booming ecosystem of around 50 exchanges down to 5, whereas in Japan they maintained approximately the same number of exchanges and market parties. In comparison, if you compare that approach with the British experience, where again we had literally hundreds of companies active in the space, and we're now down to a cohort of around 34, I think.
Tom, in the minute you've got left,
Yes.
I'll ask you this. There's a measure of agreement amongst nation states regarding AI. I know that they're all completely in agreement, but blockchain, sadly, doesn't seem to have attracted that same thing. In the 46 seconds you've got left, just give us a reason as to think that why that is, why it's not been that synergy across the world that there has been with other technology developments.
Yeah, I think it's just the start point. I mean, blockchain existed in a total vacuum, so the states, the regulators didn't have to interact with it until there was a problem. And I think the different problems that have arisen in different social contexts have dictated this enormous variance.
Thank you very much. Moving on then to Elisaveta, who's come from Brussels today. Elisaveta works and specializes in the financial regulation, the business side, blockchain, and is often involved with effectively seeing how clients approach and adopt and their attitude towards the adoption of blockchain. So perhaps you could tell us a few of your war stories, as it were.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean. So I'm Elisaveta. I'm based in Brussels. So like you mentioned, I'm a financial regulatory consultant. But what does it mean? So basically what I do is I take all those financial regulation and I implement them within financial entities, but also within digital asset service providers. So usually those regulations I'm focusing on are European financial regulations, such as DORA, you might know, Digital Operational Resilience Act, and the well-known MiCA, Market in Crypto Assets. So the way those regulations, European regulations, are perceived, I think really depends where you are in terms of timeline, where you are in terms of culture, and how you perceive it also depends on the past that you have with the technology, with anything that can happen in the industry. For instance, if we take the FTX example. So before FTX, I was in the industry and I was seeing a lot of people reluctant to regulation because it's going against blockchain nature, basically. But usually regulation is happening or is well received when something bad happened. So when FTX situation happened, of course, the dynamic shift, what people wanted is actually regulation, because they saw how things are without it. So then it depends, of course, of a situation. So we can see that now it's a bit better perceived and received than only 2 years ago. It's not that long ago that, that things were completely different. So the clients I'm dealing with, the one that comes from traditional financial industry, they are aware of it. They know what compliance takes, they know what risk takes, they know how to implement those regulations. So for them, it's not a burden for them because they used to. But if you take a new startup that is only dealing from a tech side and a blockchain side, when they see regulation, they might seem it's a burden for them because the cost of compliance, because all the investment you need to do in order to be compliant to this regulation. So they might see it as it will slow something down. But as I like to say, in regulation, it's like the blockchain trilemma. So in blockchain, you need to have decentralization, security, and scalability. And you need to find this sweet spot between the three to make it perfect. But it's very hard to achieve. So if you're willing to make the blockchain scalable, then you need to give up and compromise on, for instance, decentralization. So this is always this type of compromise you need to make. In regulation is we have a similar, I call it the trilemma, the regulatory trilemma, which is you need first to stop the malicious players, the bad players. You need to protect the consumers, but you also need to not slow down innovation. But one can come at the expense of another. So if you decide, when a regulation is created, I think everyone needs to ask the question of why the regulator created this regulation. What was the goal behind it? If it's to protect the consumer, of course, it might at some point slow down a little bit innovation because it will come at the expense of that. So if you would like to stop bad players, it's the same thing. So it really depends on the angle you are in. And I think in order for the regulator to find this sweet spot, and I think, Dean, you can confirm that, the regulator needs to be knowledgeable of what they regulate. If they don't understand what they're doing, they don't understand the content of it, the risk is that it might actually slow down innovation because they might regulate something they're not even aware of or they don't understand. So that's one risk. But at the same time, over-regulation can, of course, lead to people to shift continent or countries to try to escape it. And that's maybe not, that's not ideal. But in our context right now, I think Europe became surprisingly appealing, even though it seemed to regulate a lot. When we compare it to the US, when it's more law by enforcement, and some of my founder friends in the US, they say to me, I prefer to come to Europe because at least I know I will not have any letter from the SEC in the morning. I can sleep quietly.
Yeah, I think
peacefully.
I think that it's very interesting because in the AI context, in the blockchain context, and in the cryptocurrency context, Europe is very much, isn't it, further down the line than the UK. There's MiCA, the AI Act as well. And I'm intrigued and interested and thoroughly supportive of your position that because of the certainty for businesses, for example, Europe has become a much better place to be looking at those kind of innovations. So do you have any examples of that or anything that you can tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Examples, it's some founders who come from the US, they decide to create an entity in Europe because even though it might be a burden, of course, at least they can sleep peacefully, I would say. So that's the compromise they need to make. At least they're not surprised if something comes, they are aware of what it takes. And of course, what it takes, it's usually usually on the cost side. So the bigger the company is, the more it will need to invest in the compliance work it takes. But on the other side, a lot of a smaller company comes to me also and asking, okay, but if I need to spend as much money as a giant like Binance, I will not survive. But the thing I will say is that it should be proportional to your systemic risk you have also.
Yeah.
If you are a small startup, if you're just starting out, of course, show the regulator you're in good faith. You start the process of being compliant. But if you don't have a systemic risk, if you don't have any risk on the economic stability, you will not need to spend as much money as a Binance will need to in order to be compliant. You know, so it's really, I think it should be proportionate into the size you have and the potential risk you might have on the market. So that's the different aspect I have, and the one, like I mentioned before, the companies who comes from a traditional background, they have it easier because they already have those reflexes. So if you go to a bank, they see MiCA. For them, it's like a MiFID. You know, they know what it takes. They already they can hire the people. They have the budget for it. They have to have the budget for it. But if you go to a smaller startup, the risk compliance, the IT can be even one person. So how this person will deal with it, that's very interesting also to know, because as we know, the crypto asset service regulation comes into force for service providers in December. So from December, they basically will need to be compliant in order to offer the services within Europe. And you can be from the US, you can be from the UK. It's really about whom you're targeting. So if you target European residents, you will need to have the license. So I will be curious to see in a year from now how the market reacts, if really it slowed down innovation or still it allowed. I think it will still allow, because like I mentioned, if you're a small startup, you are incentivized to still create, to still do what you do best, innovate, but keeping in mind the compliance side, but not to put all your resources into it. You know.
Thank you very much.
So, yeah.
Stefan, coming to you now. You work on a day-to-day basis, effectively, for a trade association dealing with blockchain, representing native blockchain companies. And tell us a bit, please, if you wouldn't mind, about your interaction with policymakers within the market and things of that nature.
Yeah, sure. I actually come here today. My name is Stefan. I come here today in two hats. So as you can see on the screen, I'm a consultant at APCO, which is a public affairs company. And within APCO, we also created Blockchain for Europe, which is a trade association representing native blockchain companies. We have 27 companies ranging from, CRASPs, so more centralized, to more decentralized protocols, all the way to blockchain analytical companies. And we represent them primarily before policymakers, regulators in Europe and globally. So I'm glad that Elisabetta mentioned the sweet spot, because primarily what we're trying to do is to create a dialogue between the market and those who create the law, those who regulate, the governments. And in that, you need to remember that you're all very experienced, understand blockchains, how it works, and what's AI, and all of those innovations. But for the government, all of this stuff is completely new. They need to learn it from somewhere. They might not have an access to similar talent that you have. Not all of the people like to work for governments as much as they like to innovate on the private sector. So what we try to do is to give them the access on one hand to the markets, to the companies that innovate, that come up with new solutions, that try to come up with something that haven't been seen before, and on the other hand, give the market side, the companies that actually innovate, an access and channel their concerns whenever there's a new regulation coming in, whenever there's a new policy coming in from the government side. So what we do as a trade association, we facilitate that dialogue, we monitor all the happenings taking place in the government side, but at the same time, we come up as a market with our strategies, and we try to make sure that whenever there's anything happening concerning, we've seen lately a lot of developments on the policy side in the European Union, such as the market crypto assets regulation, DORA, that also Elisabetta mentions. We want to make sure that the market is involved in co-creating those regulations, that the impact that's going to come with once the regulation is going to start to apply is going to be taken into consideration already at the stage of drafting.
Do you think that there are, I suspect the answer will be no, but sufficient partnerships, initiatives between government and the private sector? And if the answer is no, which I see Alan shaking his head, and I think we all probably would agree with it, the answer being no, what would you like to see in terms of initiatives to actually progress that?
Well, I mean, I would say, the market is not afraid of regulation, first of all. I mean, very often they actually would like to receive more of clarity around the law that's going to apply to whatever they create, right? What's the nature of token? How is it going to be understood? If I issue a token, if I transfer a token, will the ownership of whatever is, let's say, underneath that token is also going to be transferred? All of these questions we try to ask the regulators, trying to show them the complexity behind the technology that we're trying to deal with. So, the answer is, well, we'd like to see more of that dialogue, more interest in learning new things. As Tom mentions, regulator very often does not want to regulate because it's a risk for them, right? They need to do something new. They need to expose themselves to something they haven't done before in the past. It is difficult. We try to understand them too. But at the same time, that's why our primary mission is to fighting with the misconceptions coming around technologies, how it's used, what it can do, to voice out the concerns that, with FTX happens, it's not because it's blockchain, it's because it's a crime, it's a fraud, exactly. And fraud is always going to be a fraud, whether it's going to be on-chain, off-chain, and whatever, right? The fraud happens all the time in traditional worlds. Then why we associate it with blockchain all of a sudden when it happens related to the crypto company?
So one of my issues is, and I think probably, I'm not saying all of us up here are guilty, I probably am guilty of it, I try not to be, is I think there is so much jargon that sometimes others from outside the community just think, do you know what, this is all too complicated. I really can't be involved with this because I don't really understand what they're saying. It's like a clever person's club, which it really shouldn't be. I don't know whether that's something you found, whether that's something you agree with, and what we can do about it.
Well, this is where the role of the trade association comes in, because in the end we are the facilitator of the dialogue. We try to translate the concerns, very often very technical, on a very nitty-gritty level, to the policymaker side, understanding both sides and what could be helpful for them to know about it, what's useful for them to take into account when they regulate. On the other side, translate also the concerns of policymakers and they thinking, they looking at the and the regulation and technology. So in the end, you need to understand both sides, you need to be in the middle, and perhaps what's also, on a very pragmatic level, associating 27 companies as we do under one association is also an easy access to that market for the policymaker. They don't need to talk to all of them separately. They can just go to the association, the secretariat of ours, to Blockchain for Europe in this case, and ask them, look, what is the market thinking about that? What is going to happen about this? Tell me who I can talk to, where I can access this expertise, that I'm missing in a particular context.
Thank you. Well, last but by no means least, we have Mayor Hillary all the way from Reno, the Mayor of Reno. We're very pleased to have you here.
Yeah.
And you're going to talk to us about the initiatives that you've been at the forefront of in Reno.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Reno Mayor Hillary Shivi. I'm also currently the president of the United States Conference of Mayors. I have the honor this year to represent all mayors throughout the United States. A big believer in Web3. It's so interesting to have these conversations about government because typically politicians, I'm sure Alan will agree with me, it's not popular to be the first to go out there, especially as a politician, to try something and certainly to talk about blockchain or NFTs or cryptocurrency. And so I just appreciate you more than you know because I come from a space, matter of fact, I should ask, any of you have been to the biggest little city? Any of you been to Burning Man? Oh, one person back there. Who's the burner? You're the burner? Yeah. So Reno, if you don't know it, we are the biggest little city. I guess everyone would say, okay, where's that located? That's like, we are, I guess, the second biggest city in Nevada compared to Las Vegas. How many of you have been to Las Vegas? There you go. Okay, now you guys know where Nevada is. I got it. But anyway, so Reno was predominantly a gaming town for so long. And I was born and raised there. And I would say this, In the recession in 2008, Reno was the highest in foreclosures and unemployment. And at that time, when I took office, I said, we have to really diversify our economy. We really were just known for predominantly gaming. All of a sudden, we started taking on a lot more risk and innovation. Obviously, big believer in risk and innovation for, cities, because that's, how you revitalize them, and especially in a city where mine was really, really struggling. All of a sudden, companies like Tesla, Switch, Amazon, Apple all started building and investing, their massive gigafactory there. But a lot of it had to do with, I think, the political environment, that we were A, willing to take risk, and B, we're also really receptive to, the future and what it looks like, right? Whether it's EV vehicles to blockchain technology. And so I really sort of fostered this environment with my team at the city to say, listen, we're going to fail a lot. We're probably going to be very unpopular. I might never get elected again, but we won't know unless we don't try. And so we, the first project we did the first public art NFT for something called the Space Whale for Burning Man, which was really interesting because I wanted other people to be able to share our art in my city because I'm so proud of it. Not just people that are, physically in my city. So, and then the other thing we did is we put our historical properties on the blockchain so they cannot be manipulated. We think that that's really important. If you think about it, forever and ever and ever, we'll be able to have all those resources on the blockchain. And, when we're gone someday, it will always be there. That we, and again, won't be able to be manipulated. That's really important for historical properties. And then lastly, we've started to shift to do all of our staff reports in AI, because I really want people out of their desks, and I want them, out where they're making a difference, interacting with their public and the people that they serve. I think that that's much more important than being behind a desk. And so with AI, obviously, we can be so much more efficient, but also more accurate. We can be a lot more accurate when it comes to presenting staff reports. I guess like for you at Parliament, I would say, how many times does someone get up in front of you, gives a presentation, and you're like, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. But I think that's where, this technology is really changing the game for governments. And my role the last year has been to, introduce a lot of this to mayors. And sometimes they look at me and they're like, oh, that's, like you were saying, I think the dark web, you called it. And at first, yes, but once they start using this technology, we did sort of a test case with mayors a couple weeks ago with ChatGPT, like their mouths just dropped to the floor. And so my last year has really been trying to embrace innovation for government and your local elected leaders.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I think the amount of innovation that you're telling us about there, and this is very much you and your team pushing this through, is it? Because one of the things, I don't know whether others on the panel will agree, and maybe that we just discuss this briefly shortly, but one of the things I think it's easy to say is that there's a huge amount of resistance to new ideas. People are fundamentally scared of what they don't understand and what they don't know. How has that been in terms of your ability to deliver?
Yeah. Well, that is very, very real, especially, like I said, being a politician and going out there and being like, hey, we're going to do this. And I'm just really lucky. I've got my directors of awesomeness and chief innovation officer and city manager here with me. And at first, you really do have to have a team that says, okay, yeah, she's crazy, but let's go out there and do it anyway. The other thing is just be very, very real and honest when you go out there with the people. Like in my community, I had to be honest and say, this may not work. We might fall on our ass. But if we don't try, we're not going to be the city where people like you guys want to have great ideas and foster innovation. But if I am that person that says, hey, I welcome you, I welcome the innovation, I welcome, just don't be boring, that kind of, foster that type of environment, I think cities will be so much better. And not to mention, with politicians today, you hear so much and it's so much rhetoric. I would say, especially in politics, if you go out there and you be authentic and you tell them the truth and you tell them, yes, this might be a pilot, like you talked to Alam, that I think people are much more receptive to hear it truthfully, to say this may or may not work.
Thank you very much. We're moving into question territory. We've got 10 minutes. It's very dark out there, so I'm afraid I can't see whether anyone's got their hand up
That's
or
true.
not. If they have, someone will find you with the microphone. Oh, that's better. It's not just me. If there are, for the moment, no questions and we'll allow you some thinking time, I'll ask one, if I may, to get us started. It's very much picking up the point that we were just discussing about. So the title of this piece is The Role of Governments in Fostering Innovation. But how much is it, and if you could keep your answers relatively brief, please, how much is it incumbent upon governments, and how much is it really to say it's not just governments who should be charged with that responsibility? Perhaps I'll ask you, Alan, first.
I think that's a great question, because it's got to be a partnership. And in the reality, innovation will come from the private sector. So the private sector needs to come up with a plan, convince government that it's worthy, that it can go forward, and the government's responsibility is to create the right regulation, as we've heard. And I think that's why I was underlining we need to find discrete areas, and in order to build confidence. I mean, Hillary managed to get confidence from her first project, and then people will go with you then thereafter. And I think that's the sweet spots that we might have heard. And it's a good tension, it's a positive tension between the private sector and the government holding back a little bit, the private sector pushing a little bit, and then in that environment, I think we'll get a positive tension to create even more innovation.
Hillary, I'll go to you next, then I'll go on to the private sector and then the lawyer. Your views?
Are you looking at me?
Yes.
Like, yeah, you. I would say this is super important. This is where the private and public sector absolutely have to work together. As you've seen, I think government is totally very antiquated, okay? We all know that. There's been a lot of failure in government. There's a lot of things government should not be doing, and they get into that space and get into big trouble. That's where the private sector, you guys out there, make a huge difference. And what I would say, especially if you have applications for government or innovation in our spaces, this is where, any conference that I speak at, I say, get to know, I guess, like for you guys it would be Parliament. I'm like, how many of you have met your mayor, right? I need you. I want you to contact me with your great ideas and things that I can help you foster your innovation and open those doors. Because I think that's some of our biggest power is I can at least open the door for you, but I need your innovation. And so that's where I think we come together like this, private and public, are super critical.
Thanks. Tom, I'm going to ask you about legal impediments. As I say, please keep it brief, and then I'll ask Elisabetta and Stefan. But legal impediments to those kind of partnerships.
How to answer that? I mean, I think it was, I believe it was Ronald Reagan who said, the most terrifying phrase you can hear is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah.
The wrong laws made by uninformed policymakers or a regulator that's just had half of its blockchain talent poached by a Silicon Valley startup, that sort of government, that sort of regulatory environment can get it wrong, can ruin an opportunity. But as I said, in my opening comments, you cannot have a purely anarchic system with no government in there at all. The government, particularly in the Japanese example, where it interacted with trade associations that were competent and, identifiably the good actors, that is the role, I think, for the government. The role of someone who can nurture and prevent the bad behaviours, but it's certainly not incumbent on government to lead from the front, I would say. And I'd just like to say, I'd really like to go to Reno.
Me too. Stefan and Elisabetta, your views about the assistance the private sector can give to actually bring this more into the public consciousness and hopefully then greater adoption. Whoever wants to go first.
Go first.
Well, I think actually you are the person to talk about it because you are this intermediary between both. So I think it's very good to have initiative in Europe, such like Blockchain for Europe, because this is basically the person, the entity who can take what the regulator wants and and translate it to the private sector, and vice versa as well. Take the word from the private sector and translate it into the regulatory world. So I think that's very important to have. And even though it's not yet where we want it to be in terms of communication, I think in this industry, it's still evolved quite quickly. So we have in Europe some pilot regime also that were created, sandboxes. We have some room for innovation and starting practicing it. So I think Europe is not there. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think it's going to a good direction. And we have in Brussels some people who are very advocates and who are this few people of contact that you know if you talk to them, they will be the porte-parole, like we say in French, to the regulator and vice versa.
Stefan?
I'll be very brief. I fully agree. And on the top of that, I feel like from our experience, it's important to show what problems we're trying to solve with technology, rather than show how technology is great and cool and so on and so forth. Regulators are very, very pragmatic. They want to understand, okay, so what problems you're trying to solve with that? And that's also a part of our job, to make sure that we take whatever is happening in the sector and we translate it in the way that we show this is the problem we're trying to solve with this. This is how you achieve certain privacy aspects. This is how you achieve certain immutability of data, and so on and so forth, right? So we need to make sure that we use the right language also when we speak to policymakers and put those use cases up front.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, yes. Oh, okay, we've got 3 and a bit minutes, so let's take them.
Oh, hello. Hi. I'm just here. I've
Hello.
got a couple of questions for Mr. Cairns, if I may.
Yes.
The spring budget revealed that 3.4 million is to be put into the digitalisation of the NHS. How exactly can blockchain be harnessed to help create the much needed level playing field of care? And secondly, in the mix of lots of pressing issues needing to be addressed in the UK, where does the Conservative Party prioritise digital innovation in improving public services?
I think they're great sets of questions. So the first one is that digitization of the NHS, I don't want to frighten people. In some ways, that's moving still from fax machine to email for appointment making. And that's how basic it will be in some hospitals in some parts of the country. So although that might sound like a large sum of money, the reality is it isn't going to go where we want it to go, but it will transform elements. And the NHS is almost like a faith, and people worship the NHS. So we've got to be really cautious about how we introduce blockchain, because we've got to have confidence with people, and that's why I've tried to highlight some discrete areas, maybe not in the NHS, but the reality is blockchain can be transformational within the NHS in terms of medical records, in terms of access, in terms of privacy, in terms of AI, exploiting what blockchain can offer within that space. So that's what I'd like to get to, but I think we've got some baby steps to take before we get to that. And in relation to the second part of your question, I think there needs to be some senior politicians that are great champions. And there's probably no better politician than the Prime Minister in this area. This is what he loves. But the trouble is, or the challenge is, he's Prime Minister dealing with so many other areas of policy. So I think that there needs to be in the Department for Science and Innovation a minister there that is prominent, that has been tasked deliberately about how to have the powers to go into other departments, taking this technology to things like the DVLA, things like the Land Registry, to say, do you know what, this is what this technology can do. Because I think those departments in themselves are so many interested bodies defending their own positions and therefore don't want the change, and therefore it needs to be a pioneering minister using that prime ministerial support in order to bring about the change we want to see.
Thank you. If we steal a couple of minutes...
Dean, can I say something just briefly on that, on the NHS point? So I'm from an NHS family. My dad's a consultant, my mum was an A&E nurse, my sister's a GP. And all these people talk about the crippling volume of paperwork they have to do. The blockchain can resolve that problem. It can free them up for hours of actual patient care. And it's just, if executed correctly, it would just be an enormous solution. We really need it.
Now, I've no idea whether we all get sort of struck down at the 0 point. We've got 38 seconds. If we've got time to slightly steal a couple of minutes, very happy to take a couple more questions. Yes.
Mike, thank you. Thank you for this insightful panel. I have two questions. One regarding the MiCA regulation. And you said that the regulation is here in order to protect investors and users, but don't you think that it's somehow rude to startups because it's adding some kind of constraints? And regarding always MiCA regulation, shall we wait for another update of this regulation, especially regarding DeFi protocols, DAOs? I think that it's not yet covered by this current regulation. And my next question is for Stefan regarding his association of 27 companies. It's interesting to have a kind of a bridge between business and regulators. It's wonderful. My question is how to get involved in this kind of association. What is the criteria to select the companies? And is there some place for startups in this kind of association?
So
Thank you.
Elisabetta and
30,
Stefan.
30 seconds, so we'll try.
Yeah.
So thank you for your question. Indeed, it can be hard for a crypto asset service provider to move within MiCA, but we need not to forget that this regulation is for service provider, for third parties. So it's like with under MiFID, if you're in the traditional financial sector, if you would like to open a traditional investment fund, it makes sense for you to be regulated because you deal with people's assets. So it makes sense as a third party to have some rules because you're not only a protocol, you're not automated, you are a company, you are a service provider, you are third parties who is dealing with client assets. So it makes sense to be regulated. But again, we will see in the future how things will evolve. It will slow down some players. It will filter out some companies for sure, but maybe it will be for a good cause. I think it could be a good thing actually, because like I say, in this business, you cannot be too cautious when you deal with people assets. And for your second question, from the DeFi standpoint, indeed, MiCA is not covering DeFi because MiCA is not covering when a service is provided in a fully decentralized manner. And this is the whole discussion we have in Europe and in the world, is what fully decentralized mean. We don't have an answer yet. I know the Parliament and the Commission is working on this during the next year. I'm curious to see what they will come up with, but this is another set of rules because it's a protocol. It's something that is ex ante. A service is something different. It's a person who is providing a service. Here we talk about some automation and a protocol. So I think it should be dealt separately, and I'm curious to see how it will be dealt with.
Thank you very much. Stefan, last word to you, and probably a very brief word, I'm afraid, because we really are already over our time. So if you could answer the question.
I'll be very brief. For the moment, we focus on established actors, so unfortunately, we do not associate startups. But please reach out to us. We're always happy to discuss how we can collaborate with all kinds of players in the market.
Thank you very much. That was excellent.
That was
It surprised me. Thank you so much. Can I ask everyone to show their appreciation for our truly international and truly excellent panel today?
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.